Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the week 7 of our course, and this week we'll be talking about fashion in the post-independence India. So the impact of fashion, as we know, is a big one. I mean, the impact of the fashion, as we see that, I mean, it has grown quite a bit in the post-independence era in India. And the thing is that, I mean, as we see that this idea of the idea of fashion, something that is we can understand in terms of like style, preference, and then of course, like, I mean, the taste, those are related to a particular time or a particular time frame, as we can understand it. So this is something we have seen that had grown from late 19th century, mostly in Western Europe, and then slowly we see with the interventions in the early 20th century in Western Europe, this tendency towards understanding fashion and its relationship to a number of different kind of materials and objects, and mostly predominantly we see this idea of fashion to be associated with textile, has sort of like, I mean, also been influential in India as well. And now the thing is that, I mean, as we have already discussed in the earlier module, that how in the colonial period we find that if there is this idea of this new mill-made fabric which was imported from Manchester, or like, I mean, something which were imposed on the indigenous people or in the Indian people by the British, if those were the things which were understood as fashion. And of course we also see like particular way of like draping sari, or like, I mean, sort of like, I mean, jacket, blazers and all those things, and then being them combined with dhoti and things like that for men, those can also be understood as like, I mean, the different fashion statements in this different point in time. Now something happened drastically different when India gained its independence from the British rule. So in 1947, when we see that this was this decisive time, this moment in which we could understand that the nation, the leaders in the nation would take charge of this newly independent nation in terms of like, I mean, the so-called progress, development and advancement of this nation. So then what happened, and then how these ideas also made a difference, or like, I mean, also made an intervention into how we understand the idea of fashion in the field of textiles. So we'll start our discussion with redefining the traditional meaning and associations of textiles. So by that what I mean is that there is always this kind of tendency in the field of Indian textile studies where we find that there is the Indian textiles, like, I mean, it can be those untailored pieces of fabric, that can be sari, that can be different kind of scarves, patka or sash, that can be dhoti, a number of different other kind of fabric like shawl or shoulder cloth or any of those things. So from those things we definitely see that the designers from 1950s, they have sort of pushed the boundaries and tried to understand that if this kind of untailored fabric, or like the kind of tailored garments as well, like pajama, jama, angrakha and so many other different kind of those tailored garments, how those can be associated or how those can be redefined according to the taste and requirement of a particular time. And so this is something we need to understand, that when we are looking at this particular time after India's independence, there is this we can understand that there was a need for a newness, that there was a need for the Indian leaders, not only just the political leaders but the leaders in the field of textile, fashion, culture and many different other sectors. All of them, they definitely wanted a deliberate break from the material culture, the visual culture which was prevalent in India, but at the same time also did not want to completely deny this long past India had, and that could go back long back the colonial period. So this kind of aspects, we find that there is already a kind of this issue in which some of those textiles in the Indian context which were looked at, those were understood as timeless. And when I say timeless in quotes, I always say this with a caution, because this idea of timeless, it is already it can be a bit tricky, because in terms of this idea of timeless, we see that there is a tendency, we can understand that something that remains unchanged over time, but in reality we cannot really see anything that remains unchanged over time. So maybe the visuality can remain the same. In terms of, if we think about the Kanchipuram saris, there are particular kind of motifs which were been woven on those saris for generations. If that visual outcome can be understood as something that remains unchanged, but then we also need to understand that how the community structure changes, how the making of the yarn changes, how then the dyeing technique and everything else changes. So it's not really like, if we understand something as unchanged, it actually remains unchanged. There are many changes that perhaps happen behind the visual appearance of the fabrics or the textiles, but which usually remain ignored or unacknowledged. So for that reason, we cannot really call any of the textile or any kind of material culture as timeless. However, the idea of timeless, when I say this with a caution, then it's usually predominantly I sort of like, I mean, indicate that to this, the visual appearance or the aesthetics of particular kind of textiles which seem to have retained its sort of like, I mean, its earlier forms from the past generations, and that is something which is usually understood as timeless. It can be the aesthetics of the Kanchipuram saris, it can be the aesthetics of the Bengal jamdanis, or any of those kind of fabric which can be readily recognized by people across generations. So if that is one of the ways in which we see that the Indian textiles are defined by calling them so-called timeless, then the other aspect was to sort of introduce certain things which would address the transformation with not only in terms of like, I mean, the transformation in the livelihood and the other sectors of the artisanal communities, but transformation in terms of like, I mean, how those transformation can stand for the changing ideologies of a new nation. So that is something we find that to be much more important than of course, like, I mean, you know, acknowledging the transformation in the artisanal communities. So this sort of this duality we see, in one hand that there is a need for establishing that the timelessness of the Indian textile, it still retains its beauty, and at the same time it still retains its original context. And all those words, beauty, original, these words are kind of contentious. So if this is something we find, in one hand this kind of ideas have been created, on the other hand there was also the need for making this so-called timeless and traditional textiles being more receptible for the urban audience, or like, I mean, the people who would be sort of joining the working sectors of this newly independent nation. So this duality in terms of like, I mean, understanding something that remains unchanged and then something that needs to be transformed. So both these things we find that to be there, practiced extensively in the field of textile making in the post-independence India, and that is something that makes the fashion industry, or like, I mean, this so-called idea of fashion, that is this something to do with the taste and preferences. So those things become very important and sort of layered if we consider all the socio-political and economic changes in the after 1947. Now with those things we also find that the indigenous textiles and the designers interventions were very important in this area, and that's because if we see that there are certain kind of transformations those are happening in the textile sector, that also means that there is there are those designers interventions into it, and that means that, I mean, how those indigenous textile forms which have been practiced by the communities for centuries or even millennia, so then with the arrival of this urban educated designers, and then how their design interventions that made difference in terms of how this traditional textiles are perceived by the viewers, at the same time also how those traditional textiles are sort of like, I mean, being researched and collected and so on. Also, like, I mean, how they were made or absorbed as part of this newly made societies in the newly independent country. Now, the other thing we'll be looking at in this week would be those very important Vishwakarma exhibitions, and those exhibitions we can understand in the field of textile studies to be path breaking, and that's because it sort of like considers this artisan, designer, and sort of like the researcher collaborations in the field of textile studies. And in this kind of like interventions, if we consider, in which we see that many different stakeholders are coming together, and this is not something we can see as something that was just conceived and then it went ahead with the flow, but it was very well organized, thought out, and its impact was long lasting. Even today, some of the textile practitioners that we see in our country, they recall their memory of the Vishwakarma exhibitions and how the conversations, experiments, or like the exposure they have received during these exhibitions have made a huge impact in the kind of practice they still do. Now then we'll also look into this idea of sustainability, slow fashion, and their social impact. So if you remember, in the week 1 we sort of mentioned that why my stress has been on the handmade, like the hand spun, hand woven, and handloom textiles. So perhaps in many of these cases today we do not really see hand spun textiles. However, the handloom textiles or the textiles which are made by the weavers, and of course like with the intervention of many different people, from the agricultural sectors to washer people to the dyers and so on. So those kind of production technique and their social impact is something we'll be sort of focusing on in this week as well. And then how those ideas, some of those ideas, we see them to be relevant in the very early times, and then how those ideas are still relevant today at this juncture when we are increasingly sort of going in the digital platform for not only in terms of making knowledge available or producing knowledge, but also at the same time like in the market sector and everything, in which we do see that there is a disconnect between how the production of objects are there and then where we are situated. So can understanding of this of the details of the production techniques, the people who are involved in production, all those issues, can those things make an impact in terms of how we perceive textiles, how we appreciate textiles? So those kind of aspects we'll also be looking at in this week. And of course sustainability, when we say this word, so then we kind of like look back at certain ideas we have already discussed so far in terms of ecology, in terms of environment, and then of course also like sustainment of particular kind of community livelihoods of people. So those issues we'll be looking at in this week. So starting with this, that if I give a small background of what kind of like socio-political situation or socio-economic situation we had in the 1940s, and why there was a need for sort of like redefining fashion or thinking about textiles in this particular era, is something we can sort of relate it back to some of the developments that happened in the 1940s and especially after the independence of India. So in 1947 we see the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and then of course like with the intervention of some of the other people. So for example, we'll find that as Homi Bhabha, and then like of course then Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, later on Pupul Jaikar, and so on. All of them, they have sort of thought about this newly independent country in many different ways. So in one hand we find that Nehru was someone who was obsessed with the idea of technology and development, and rightly so. That's because we can see during this time, after the colonial era, there was a need for sort of revamping the production sectors, and then of course how to make India, or like how to sort of like build India with like many different kind of technologies. At the same time, like it's not just for empowering the rural sectors or the metropolitan sectors, but also making particular kind of technologies or facilities being available in the rural sectors. And so for those things there was also a need for sort of like setting up certain sort of schools or institutions of technology. There was also a need for establishing certain institutes of higher education where researchers not only in the field of technology but also in the field of humanities, fine arts and everything else can be conducted. And because all of those issues, like if we think about technology and then of course the advancement in the field of science but also in the field of humanities to support the societal cause and what technology can do to the society, all those things were given priority. And that is how we find that during this time a number of projects were taken up, and some of the projects would certainly be in terms of setting up some of the institutes as I have mentioned. And here on screen in the left side of the screen we see that this is a photograph that shows that Dr. Homi Bhabha and Jawaharlal Nehru and all of them, they are there in the Department of Atomic Energy in 1954. And we can see that this is actually in the formative stage, so a number of models and then ideas were discussed. Those can be then sort of developed full-fledgedly in the later times. And then if this is one of the aspects we find, and of course some of the famous statements by Nehru that also emphasize that how the dams and the silos would be those new sites of the nation, like the dams would be the new temples, those that is required in India, instead of thinking about temple to be something that is just related to religion. So those kind of ideas we see that there is already a proclamation about the change in the society, and then also what kind of change is required in the society, culture and everything else for us to sort of move forward and leave behind the colonial legacy. Of course, we are still fighting with the colonial legacy today, but those are the kind of ideas we see them to be there prominently featured in Nehru and some of the other leaders' conceptualization of this new nation. Now, if this is one of the things we find that there was a push towards technology and so-called development, then the other thing would be to think in terms of craft sectors. And as I have mentioned in the earlier module, that the craft sectors, the artisanal sectors are perhaps the second largest unorganized occupational sector in the Indian subcontinent and in India, of course. So why I say second largest, of course, if we think about the agricultural sector, and sometimes we definitely see that agricultural sectors and the craft sectors, they have overlappings, as we have already seen in terms of understanding dyeing, in terms of procuring the raw material for weaving and everything else. But then if we think about agriculture as a separate sector from the artisanal sector, then perhaps the agricultural sector will be the foremost occupational sector in India. And then the craft sector can include various kinds of textile making, and then of course the other kind of object making that can be in the field of metal, wood and so on. And all those things we see them to be unorganized. They are definitely not centralized. We see them that the weavers and then also the other sort of the groups or the communities of craft maker, they might have local guilds or associations to sort of operate, or the cooperatives, but then we do not really see them to be usually there under one umbrella, that a centralized body that can sort of take charge of all different craft people in the Indian subcontinent. So this is something we find that the craft sector was very much unorganized. But at the same time, during the colonial period, we have seen this high relevance of craft, especially textiles, and then it is something that cannot be ignored, that for the trade relations, for building culture, at the same time also keeping the strength of the society intact, craft is indispensable. And that is the reason we find that there were a number of craft activists, for example Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay and later on Pupul Jayakar and so on. They have stressed the idea of prioritizing craft. So what we see during this time that Jawaharlal Nehru also have sort of spoken to Pupul Jayakar and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, mostly Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay convinced him to set up this All India Handicrafts Board in 1952. So this is something we find that it was perhaps this first attempt of bringing the craft sector under perhaps like one umbrella. Even today we see that the majority of the craft sectors, they still operate as unorganized sector, but then having their representation in the governmental level, that also enables different kind of sort of like facilities those could not be given to people beforehand. So those things we see them to be there prominently presented in Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's idea. Now briefly we have spoken about Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay in the earlier module, as she was someone who we find as a follower of Gandhi, and who has also taken up like the cause of sort of speaking in favor of handloom, handwoven textiles, and not for her love for textile, but it was for betterment, it was for making the country self-sustainable, and then also practicing this self-sufficiency, something that Gandhiji has also stressed on. So we find that Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, she was also jailed in the late 1930s, and she was a prominent freedom fighter and social activist who has worked extensively in the 1930s and 1940s. So after the independence of India, we find her to be like much more prominently presented in the ministry, and that is how that was the first time we find that she was able to bring attention of the government towards the craft sector. And in the 1952, when All India Handicrafts Board, or AIHB, was established, then Chattopadhyay was selected as the chairperson of it. And then after she was selected as the chairperson of this handicraft board, we find that she had extensively traveled all across the country for meeting craftspeople everywhere. And then it was initially this kind of travels that we find that to be there, that was to gain an idea about what kind of craft making are still there, and what kind of craft making needs to have motivation and support and everything else. And so with those, we definitely see that of course that during this time Pupul Jayakar had also stepped in, and she had also traveled extensively and sort of in order to revitalize the craft sector. Now for Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, we find that she was instrumental in terms of not only just traveling to those places, but also understanding and being sensible to the requirement of the craftspeople. And some of the craftspeople, we still see them today, or their forefathers, they still talk about Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. For example, we see the late master Kalamkari painter Gudappa Chetty Garu, and he and his father Lakshmaya Garu was someone who was directly benefited from Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So those kind of aspects, we definitely see that how the artisans who are there today, they either their family or their teachers and so on, they have directly benefited from Chattopadhyay's intervention in the craft sector. And that is how we see that eventually in 1956-1957 the weaver service centers were established in India. So after the establishment of the All India Handicrafts Board, and then eventually it became All India Handicrafts and Handloom Board. And so after that we find that slowly there was a sort of there were plans to sort of do this idea, or the plans to sort of implement the idea of extending the governmental support to the artisanal sectors. it was sort of materialized by establishing the weaver service centers. And we see that, I mean, there are regional weaver service centers, those were established all over the country. For example, how in various sectors, in terms of like in Delhi, in Calcutta, in Hyderabad, in Madras or Chennai, and many other places, how in Varanasi and so on, how those weaver service centers were established, and they functioned in terms of like, I mean, providing training, at the same time also sort of increasing sales, and then sort of like, I mean, extending support to the local weavers and textile makers in the country. So those aspects, we see them to be there by this kind of steps which were taken in the 1950s. Now the other kind of activities we also find, so for example in 1948 the Calico Museum of Textile was established in Ahmedabad, and Gautam Sarabhai and Gira Sarabhai, they were responsible for sort of establishing this museum after art historian and master interpreter Ananda Kumar Swami's advice. And then, like, I mean, the Sarabhai collection, I mean, they already had a collection of extensive collection of textiles, at the same time other artifacts and objects. So those collections were then made into into this one Calico Museum, and then, like, I mean, the Sarabhai collection, and all of them initially, like, I mean, the Calico Museum was sort of like, I mean, situated elsewhere, and then both these collections were sort of like, I mean, you know, relocated to the premise of the Sarabhais. And so there, what we see that, I mean, this kind of making of the institutions were also instrumental, because from the 1950s the Calico Museum also invited international scholars as John Irwin and of course Margaret Hall and other people to, and then they were also, in terms of like, I mean, how they were associated with people like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and others. So all of them, they sort of got together and started doing research on the textiles, and those are primarily from the Indian collections. So this is something we did not really see that to be there earlier. And then from 1946 we see the this prolific Marg magazine was also being published, and then people like Mulkraj Anand and other prominent craft activists and craft scholars, they were there in the editorial board of this magazine. So this is how we find that a number of different activities, they started shaping up after the independence of India. And then in one hand, if we see that this were the establishment of these museums, and then, like, I mean, or the magazines and different platforms for promoting craft, but then also we find that some of those governmental measures were instrumental for providing support to the artisanal sectors, which was equally important. And that is how we find that there was a revitalization of the craft sectors, especially the textile sectors in the Indian subcontinent. We'll continue on this discussion more in the next lecture. Thank you.